We were, of course, around 1974, introduction of antidepressants. I actually had a lot of hope for those. I thought, oh, wow, what if you really can give somebody a happy pill? But it did not work. I cannot say that in my 50 years of experience, I've ever seen anyone, child, teenager, or adult, cured by a medication for depression or so forth.
Anxiety and depression are gripping adolescents, and there is no easy pill to swallow to eradicate this from their lives. Someone cannot just simply cheer up or snap out of it to solve the problem. 20% of youth between 13 and 18 live with a mental health condition, and the numbers seem to continue to grow. Could the solution to overcoming this illness be more than just medication? Could it be found in replacing the things we've deprived from our bodies?
I'm Jeff Eckert.
I'm Jason Brewer, and this is The Thought Factory.
The Thought Factory podcast is brought to you by Never the Same, cultivating students through biblical discipleship and spiritual disciplines using theology, community, and technology. Learn more at neverthesame.org.
We're glad you're with us today on the Thought Factory podcast. We've got a special guest today, Jason. It's going to be a really good episode, a person I've learned a lot from. Glad to be back here, glad to hear you, my friend.
I haven't said anything yet, Jeff, so I don't know what you're hearing.
I just heard you.
No,
you're there.
No, I'm now here, but you can't say you're glad to hear me if I haven't even said anything yet.
True, but now I do.
It's good to be here.
Yeah.
We are continuing the conversation in regards to the mental health of students, where last episode we talked to Eliza Lejeune from Pine Rest and discussing how can we provide expert advice to students that may be dealing with depression and suicide thoughts, and just that topic alone is worth listening to, but we're continuing that conversation today on the mental health of students.
It's at the forefront of all of our minds, those of us working with students, and just throughout society right now. This is a time where mental health has been highlighted because of everything that's happened in the last 12 months, and this conversation that we had a couple years ago with Jackie Sheppard, we felt like was so important to us to bring back, because she has some incredible and unique insights, and specifically on the links between physiology and anxiety, and what happens when our physical bodies can sometimes and often be the root source of our anxiety. And she has some incredible research and insight with over 50 years of experience. And I'm just glad that during this time that we're in now, we have minds like Jackie Sheppard that can help us understand this.
And for next episode, we are talking to a student who is a freshman in high school now on the topic of race. That is also a topic that we want to discuss, we want to bring to our audience in regards to what the conversation is around race, especially in our youth ministries, but also in the areas that these students are dealing with in school, online.
So that's our next episode. So join us for that. These are some important conversations, especially timely for what's happening right now in society. So that brings us to today. We are talking with a dear friend, and we have her permission to say this.
Yes.
Her age.
Yep.
We think she's the oldest person that we've had on this podcast as a guest.
I know for a definitive yes that she is the oldest.
Okay.
Unless, of course, you're not 75.
I am not 75, not quite. So she's 75 years old. Her name is Jackie Sheppard. She's had 50 years of experience and research on how the body affects the mind, will, and emotion. She's taught high school English. She started a private high school in the Atlanta area in 1988. Currently, she resides in the Kansas City area with her dear husband of 54 years, Glenn Sheppard, who is a good friend and mentor to me, a leader in the prayer movement both nationally and worldwide. And I'll just add here that Glenn, the husband of our guest, Jackie, Glenn Sheppard, is one of the men that, and the group of leaders, men and women, that helped formed what's now the National Prayer Committee. They were very formative in helping the legislation get passed in 1988 to make the National Day of Prayer officially declared as the first Thursday of May. Up until that point, it had moved around from year to year. So Glenn is a very humble man, but he has helped shape the foundation of prayer in the United States and the world. He speaks all over the world. He travels still at his age. It's amazing. So today our conversation with Glenn's wife, with Jackie, who is incredible in what she has learned and discovered in the area of science and medicine when it comes to the body and the mind. And she's been in this area, immersed in this area of anxiety and depression for decades now. Now, this has really come to the forefront, Jason, the last few years, especially with students. But she's been in this world for a long time, and I've learned so much from her about how she has learned what the connections are between these two things, between what's happening emotionally and psychologically in our physical bodies. And the first conversation I had with her, it started this awareness in me. And Jason, you and I have talked on and off air about the physiological factors that go into a student's emotional well-being these days. And so as she talked about the connections between like physiologically, like our physical bodies and emotions, it was like an awakening of awareness for me. And we've talked about this, just all the factors that students are dealing with now.
We are talking about mental state, the mental health of students, and the real reason why we have Jackie is because of the years and decades of experience. But there's a number of factors, and what Jackie does is hit on the science and the body, and not just more the digital, where we can really focus on. She has talked about it and studied it long before the smartphone has even come out.
You know, in talking with her, it reminded me of like students are, and last summer I interviewed a lot of students talking about you and your friends. How late are you up, especially during the school year when they got to get up early? But the combination of all these things, they're up all night on their phones. They're not outside a lot. So even, and I think Jackie mentions this, but even things like sunlight and getting, pure natural sunlight into your body is a factor. And drinking water is a factor. And any kind of physical activity is a factor. All these things combine now when you think about a lot of students, they've got a lack of sunshine. They've got a lack of sleep. They've got a lack of water, of good food. They've got a lack of physical activity and a lot of screen time. So you combine all those things, and we're not here as experts. We're not here as people that are professionals in psychology and physiology, but we are saying that it does make a difference in students' lives.
Ultimately, it's something that we need to think about. And that's really what we desire for you to do as well, is to think about some of these things. Because why is it that anxiety and depression are going up in students when they are getting less sleep, when they are on their phones a lot, and that's affecting their brains, and we're allowing them to ingest sugary drinks more than even decades ago? You talk about these high caffeinated energy drinks, high sugar content drinks. We just are speculating maybe, but at the same time, there's got to be a reason for some of these spikes in depression and suicide and students just dealing with anxiety nonstop. And there's got to be some sort of correlation to how we're treating our body and how God designed us, and we're not really living it out in the way that He desires us to live out.
Yeah, it's tragic what's happening, and we've been praying, Jason, and our staff for the country and for students around the country, state by state. And we're seeing the suicide rates in states, state by state.
Yeah.
The state that we're praying for this week is New Mexico, as we're recording this, and the suicide rate in that state and some others really stand out. Colorado's another one where suicide rates are really high. And I would say that I'm going to make a prediction here that I remember being in youth ministry about 15 years ago, and really at that point intentionally and I was doing it before, but got really intentional about teaching about money, finance, and resources to students. I wasn't hearing a lot of it back in those days. Now it's become more prominent. I'm going to make a prediction here, Jason. I feel like a wave that's going to come into youth ministry and it's going to come into the church is this idea of teaching on the Sabbath. I think we've lost it. I think we need to regain it. We've talked about it on this podcast a little bit. It's become an area of passion for me recently in conversations and some teachings and other things. I think that is going to be a factor. And as you listen to this interview with Jackie, I want you to be thinking about that as a filter. Think about where we are in reclaiming some of these things that maybe we've lost in our culture and society as believers that we need to regain.
I don't think you're far off in that prediction, because there's got to be a breaking point. There's got to, amongst all the stats and the research that people are doing, that we're talking to, that we're looking at, we're talking to students, and they're saying a lot of the same things. Articles are coming out of the same things. Technology industries are developing things to protect students in this way. But I think that breaking point is we can't continue on like this. And what is that solution? And again, what you said, going back to the Sabbath, going back to taking a break from all of this and allowing your body to rest. But I think you're right in that prediction of we can't just be in overdrive all the time.
Right. Enjoy this interview with Jackie Sheppard. So in July of 2017, I was in Colorado Springs at Ted's Steakhouse. I had one of the best steaks I've ever had in my life, and I ended up sitting next to this lovely woman named Jackie Sheppard, who's our guest today. And Jackie was intriguing from the very first moment we began that conversation, talking about health, talking about psychology, talking about adolescence, lots of things we got into in that very first conversation. And since then, Jackie has become a great friend. I'm on the board of directors for the National Day of Prayer with her husband, Glenn Sheppard, who is equally amazing. And so, Jackie, it's great to have you with us, and we are so excited to get into this conversation with you today.
I am thrilled to be with you all.
Thanks for joining us, Jackie.
Let's get into your background here a little bit. Tell us in a nutshell about your background and experience in working with adolescents.
Well, I think that one of the first things I need to point out is that I'm 75 years old. So I've been working with adolescents longer than a lot of people have been born. I've seen a lot of changes through the years. I have continued to be concerned because we are losing so many of our top minds and top young people to conditions that I think we can change. I taught high school English for many years. I had my own private high school that I started in 1988. I have been researching and working on mental, emotional, and addictive health. I started with teenagers, but it has progressed to adults now. And a lot of this came together for me a few years back when we made some major strides in science. And I was able to connect a lot of dots that had just been scattered. And that's when, just about the same time, Destiny Image contacted me to ask me about a book that they had heard I was working on. So that sort of brings us up to where I am. I have been married to my husband, Glenn, 54 years. I am the co-founder of International Prayer Ministries. We've been in ministry for 54 years. We have 3 children in full-time ministry with their mates, 8 grandchildren, and Jeff, as you know, a little farm with sheep, goats, a donkey, and a llama.
That's right. I've seen that. I can tell you that is true.
So that's it in a nutshell.
Jackie, you mentioned that you were working on a book, and I believe that book is called Silent Takeover. Could you just briefly tell us about what that premise is of the book?
Well, now that book was published in 2016. Silent Takeover, How the Body Hijacks the Mind. Subtitled is Overcoming Mental, Emotional, and Addictive Disorders. So I've had really good response to it. I think it's probably in its 3rd printing. I am working on another book, and that's probably the one you're referring to, and it is strictly on ADD, ADHD, and autism. It's going to be on how metabolism causes and affects ADD, ADHD, and autism.
What are some of the things that you're finding with that?
Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit, Jason, but I can't tell you everything because I want you to buy the book. I'll have a number of chapters that address certain toxic chemicals that we have the science to show that it so disrupts a pathway in the gut that, and as you probably read, the gut and the brain are vitally connected. We used to think that emotional issues and learning and behavior problems started in the brain and affected the gut because we saw so many people with digestive problems who had these disorders. Now we think it's backwards. We think that these issues start in the gut. Serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, your neurotransmitters are actually made there. In my book, Silent Takeover, I have a whole chapter on gut-brain connection. But in the new book, I want to specify various chemicals that change that. I'll also talk about certain medications that shut down important enzymes. If you're not making enough of these enzymes, your brain just will not work properly. So it too will be a science book. But I wrote Silent Takeover in lay language, and I tried to bringing enough narrative that hopefully people who don't like science would keep reading. But I think, and I really believe this, I think every parent should read these books because we're up against a very toxic environment. And then anyone who's raising a child now needs to know what to do, what not to do. And adults, we can still change it. We can still change the metabolism so that we get that gut functioning properly to produce neurotransmitters. Long answer to a short question.
Well, sorry to put you on the spot about your new book. I was just a little bit more intrigued, but clearly you are researching a lot. You are discovering new trends. And so we were wondering, what are some of those trends in teens' behaviors that you have found observed in the last decade or so?
When I started teaching school in 1964, we'd have one or two students in a room of, say, 25 teenagers that needed a little extra help after school. Behavior, we had strong discipline in those days, and so we had good discipline. So it was completely different to what the teacher sees now. What I saw to begin with was I began noticing that if they ate better, they made better grades and they behaved better. So I started doing what research I could, but in 1964, there wasn't much out there. About 1970, we got Dr. Fingold's book on how preservatives and additives affect behavior. We also, by that time, started getting some of the diagnoses of ADD, ADHD, and autism. But the main thing that I noticed was it seemed like every year we had more disturbed teenagers in the classroom. And being an adolescent counselor as well as a teacher, I had more and more people bringing their students to me. We were pastoring a church. We were pastoring churches during those years. So I had people bringing me their teenagers to elementary school kids. And I saw more and more mental, emotional learning and behavior problems. And now the numbers are staggering.
That's the thing that, Jackie, when we first had that conversation, that struck me right away was that your amount of research, your ability to think outside of the constraints of what might be considered routine thinking in these areas. And you began to theorize things that I think a lot of us have wondered about. For example, that our physical body is more responsible for our mental state than what maybe has been accepted in the past by the mainstream. And walk us through some of the key discoveries that you found on that journey as you began to develop that idea and that way of thinking.
Well, Jeff, I've always prayed over my students and for my students. And so I have to just tell you the honest truth. The Holy Spirit began sharing with me what I consider concerns that's on the heart of our Lord. And even though I couldn't get all of the information, I began to get concepts. And then I knew what to start looking for. But it's only been recent years that one of my children said to me, "Mom, science is catching up to you." We were getting so much information about various educational techniques that weren't working. We were, of course, around 1974, introduction of antidepressants and mind-altering medications. And I actually had a lot of hope for those. I thought, oh, wow, what if you really can give somebody a happy pill? But it did not work. I cannot say that in my 50 years of experience, I've ever seen anyone, child, teenager, or adult, cured by a medication for depression or so forth. So as a counselor, I was on the route of counseling, but something just kept leading me again and again to trying to figure out what's wrong in the body. We didn't have the internet, so all I could do was look where I could, but I was fortunate to meet a research pediatrician around 1983, and he's really the one that could take me into deeper water. I had ideas, I had concepts, I had theories, but he was way ahead of me. He had already for several years been trying to find out metabolically what's wrong with these kids. And so he's the one that taught me about metabolic testing, where we could test for vitamins and minerals, fatty acids, amino acids. We could even test gut function back in 1983. So he deserves so much credit for putting me on this track. And then after his death, we lost him to melanoma. I was able several years later to meet some alternative medical physicians. These were medical doctors who shared my thinking. And so we worked together. By that time, we could test neurotransmitters. We couldn't test neurotransmitters when we first started. You couldn't put a needle in the brain, in essence, and pull out the neurotransmitters. But we could test with blood, and now you can test neurotransmitters with urine. So we've come a long ways.
You often talk about how sometimes physical problems are based on what's considered maybe spiritual problems. And talk for a second about that, because I think that's interesting for us at working with adolescents. You said the numbers are staggering, and I guarantee every single youth worker listening to this can relate to that. We all know students that are dealing with all kind of different things surrounding anxiety and depression. How is that in your research? How's that connected, some of those issues and anxiety in general, to physical health?
Well, Jeff, there's a lot of information out there. They're qualified spiritual leaders and how the mind and the spirit affect the body. The lack of forgiveness, for example, causes physical problems in the body. The ruminating of negative thinking, it will actually change not just the cells of the body, but especially the neurotransmitters. Also, for example, if you look up at a blue sky, your neurotransmitter serotonin will be increased. If you play a video game, unfortunately, it increases your dopamine. So all of these things, we are body, soul, and spirit. So we've concentrated so much in youth ministry on the spiritual aspects, and I'm all for that. I often said at my private school that it took us 3 months to get them clothed and in their right minds, and then we could teach them something. However, because there's so many people, so many books, inspirational books especially, on the spirit and the soul, and also because I've been at this for 50 years, I usually start now with the body. A lot of the young people who come to me are Christians. Some of them are not. But either way, and I had a meeting with an awesome young missionary this week who's struggling with depression. I said, you've probably confessed your sins and everybody's sins. And he sort of agreed. And I said, and you've probably felt a lot of shame and guilt because you are a Christian, you're from a strong Christian home, over the fact that you're dealing with so much depression. He's shaking his head. And I said, but what I want to tell you is that I don't think you've got a spiritual problem. I don't think you've got a problem, a psychological problem. I think you have a physical problem in your body that is so affecting the production of neurotransmitters that this physical condition is causing your depression. And the good news is we can change that.
One of our past episodes, I'm going to reference it here, was one of our very first was 103. Jason, remember that? It was the theology of pizza and hummus. It was the idea of youth ministry and the theology of food and the connection to that. And if you haven't listened to that, audience, I want to encourage you to go back, because what we talk about there is what we can do to model in our youth ministries good behavior when it comes to food itself, because we typically just throw out the cheapest that we can get for students and kind of hope for the best, right?
Yeah, the podcast was based off of the fact that most of the youth ministries just use cheap pizza, a low budget, to provide food for any event or gathering, instead of thinking through the health benefits of healthy eating, and even just talking about healthy eating, healthy lifestyle in regards to food. And so there's this theology behind, do we provide cheap and quick, or do we provide food that's healthier but maybe more costly? The healthy aspect of our body correlates to how healthy our mind can be. And as we are talking to Jackie and discussing how this affects students, adolescents, the students that we are working with, we see students experience anxiety, depression. These things are causing suicide. The rates are increasing. In light of all that we have talked about, why do you think teen suicide is on the rise today?
I could write a whole book about that. It's hard to encapsulate it. Maybe I should, because it's certainly so much. It's so much more prevalent than it was. In my first teaching experience, we had a teen suicide, and it was so rare, and it devastated me. It was over a low algebra grade. So you realize that part of it is that when someone is a teenager, every molehill is a mountain. We could have solved that algebra grade. However, it's so much more than that now, because so many of the young people who do commit suicide, many of them have been on medications for years. And medications do change your emotional response. That's its job, is to change your emotional response. So a lot of times they really do not emotionally, they can't really fathom emotionally what's going to happen if they do this to their parents and their friends, so forth. But coupled with a toxic brain, as well as the media, so much information, there's so much auto-suggestion with teenagers, where somebody does it, herd instinct, they follow, they do the same thing, whether that's suicides as well as, sad to say, homicides. I think, though, that in this deep spiritual vacuum that we have, we don't have people who are healthy in body or soul. So it's not just the spiritual vacuum. It's not just the deprivation of the soul, the mind, the will, and the emotions. But it is the fact that the body cannot do what it was designed to do. And it begins then to actually run patterns of thoughts of self-destruction.
The rise in anxiety and depression, Jackie, talk about what you're seeing as far as reversing and dealing with that for us that are parents and youth workers.
Jeff, as you recall, I often say that I worked in 15-year segments. We were a part of the mighty move of the Holy Spirit in the 70s, and so I actually was expecting every child to be divinely healed. And then we had so many years of strong emphasis on Christian counseling and all sorts of theophostic counseling and so forth. And we saw some progress, but the reason in the last 15 to 20 years I've concentrated on the body It's because if a parent brought a teenager with anxiety to me, I would do a full profile, trying to lock in on what could I change to get the right neurotransmitter production. Neurotransmitters, the precursors, what makes the neurotransmitters are amino acids. We get our amino acids from foods. So trying to create diets that might create more serotonin is the only tool I had to work with for a long time. Or acetylcholine, lowering acetylcholine or increasing acetylcholine. It was a difficult task. However, what we discovered, and I say we, it wasn't, I certainly didn't discover it, but about a decade ago, an enzyme, we've known for a long time that students with learning and behavior problems, depression, bipolar, whatever, any childhood disease also, produced more than normal free radicals in their bodies. They might produce as much as a person with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. We also knew they did not make enough of certain enzymes the body has to have. The most important enzyme they did not make is an enzyme called glutathione. Dr. Martha Herbert, who is probably the top research doctor in America today in the field of ADD, ADHD, autism, as well as teenage mental disorders. She's at Harvard. She said in an iChat in 2011 that she is now convinced that low production of glutathione is the link to ADD, ADHD, and autism. I'm convinced she's right. The reason why is if I can work with these young people and their parents or young adults to produce a greater amount of glutathione, their anxiety leaves. Then we have a landscape for counseling. We have a landscape for them to believe the truth about God, that He does love them as much as He does someone else who's functioning normally. So that was a huge, it was like the glue that began to put the puzzle together. You're supposed to get this from food, from whey, from your dairy products. Our milk is very compromised now. Many people have become lactose intolerant, or you get it from fruits and vegetables. However, because our fruits and vegetables are not nutritionally dense enough. For example, you read in my book, it takes 8 oranges to equal 1 orange from 1950. You can't eat enough fruits and vegetables. And even if you could somehow consume all of them, and even if they were all organic and you grew them in your backyard, you still have toxic rain and depleted soil. So we're living in a very toxic environment where the food source is contaminated. And then we eat so many processed foods. We eat out often. We eat foods that Lord only knows what's in those foods. I often say to people, look at the contents. If you can't pronounce it, neither can your body. So, yeah, we're in a difficult time on how to feed the body.
And that's really one of your first approaches with families and students then, is to approach them on the physical end and say, let's talk about intake, let's talk about screen time, let's talk about being outdoors, let's talk about sunshine. I've heard you say those things, and as youth workers, we're trying to get some takeaways here. Is that part of it? Is just an awareness of saying to parents and working with students directly, listen, get away from the screens, get outside, eat differently, drink water, get good sleep. It's all those basic things, right?
It is, but screen time is so damaging, as well as any connection to their technology and their electronics. And you know that these are sacred idols to them. Even when the cell phone is in the same room with most people, they will get a boost of dopamine. And when they can't find their cell phone, they have the same neurotransmitters that you get as you're initiating a panic attack. And with a teenager, because they have such a herd instinct, and now they're connected to who knows how many people through social media. Their emotions are tied into every time they touch their technology. I recommend to every youth minister, have times where they disconnect. Take them out for long camping trips or long walks. Have days when it's known they're going to disconnect, they're going to get rid of their electronics for the day or something. Most of them have never known the sound of silence. They don't know to listen to birds. But we are designed for the sounds of nature because it does certain things in our body. And you know about what I've already mentioned about it, increase in serotonin. Even if you're walking at the sea, there's lithium in the air. Lithium has been made into a medication that they use for bipolar. So we're made to get negative ions. Everything electrical is a positive ion. It drains your body. We are negative, and that will drain your body like a battery. When you reconnect, when you go outside, fresh air, sunshine, walk in the woods, just get out, touch a tree, you're going to get negative ions. And that's why you feel refreshed and your soul feels restored, because that's how God designed us.
Well, Jackie, that's why I was so intrigued from our very first conversation, is you have such a refreshing and even revolutionary way of looking at things, but yet also so in touch with how God's designed us and your experience in research, but as well as your walk with the Lord. And it's very inspiring to us. And I want to remind everyone again that her book is called Silent Takeover. It is available on Amazon and lots of other platforms. I've read it. I've actually read it twice. It's an incredible book. I would consider it groundbreaking. And I think as youth workers, as parents, I want to reiterate what she said earlier. It is a book that all of us should read, because it brings an awareness to the connection between all these things that we're seeing. We're seeing an epidemic of anxiety, depression, and recently the spike in suicide, which is heartbreaking to those of us that are working with adolescents on a regular basis. And a lot of the answers to why those things are happening, you will find in that book, Silent Takeover. And then your next book, Jackie, we definitely want to have you back to talk about what else you're finding out. And we want to thank you again for your time today.
It's been an honor to be with you, Jeff. You may want to remind them that I don't charge for counseling. I can be reached through Silent Takeover. There's only one T, silent.takeover@gmail.com, or Jackie Sheppard, SHEPPARD, @mac.com, or you can find me on Facebook and private message me. Say that they heard about this through you guys.
And I want to let everyone know that I've referred a few people to Jackie as well, and she will live up to that promise. So Jackie, thank you for throwing that out there, and thanks for your willingness to help, and we really appreciate it.
Okay, and blessings. May this be the best year yet.
Yes, thank you, Jackie.
Thanks, Jackie.
The Thought Factory podcast is brought to you by Never the Same, whose vision is to see new generations transformed in Christ to further the kingdom of God. Learn more at neverthesame.org.